Hi, this is Keep Up, a show exploring castles in video games. I'm your host, Gavin Davis, and I'm joined by my good friend, the castle expert, Alison Norton. Today, we look at For Honor and discuss, amongst other things, crusaders, their castles, and the people who made them.
Welcome to Keep Up. This is our second episode looking at For Honor. So Gavin, what is For Honor?
For Honor is an Ubisoft game that came out in 2017, and it's a competitive melee action game. Well, what that really means is players take part in various modes to capture castles or to duel one another, picking from one of four factions of warriors throughout history. So you've got your crusaders, you've got your Vikings, you've got your samurai, and you've got Chinese warriors, sort of taken from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms period. And each of those warriors is their own distinct class. So they have different abilities, different weapons, different play styles that all feed into and synergize with one another. So it's team-based generally. You have to work together, capture points, and siege castles. It's very anachronistic, but one way that the factions are distinguished, as well as the armor, is their fortresses. So generally the Crusaders have stone-built castles, Vikings have these kind of wooden fortresses, and the samurai have these feudal Japanese castles. So, Ali, broadly speaking, bear in mind we're dealing with anachronism here. How story accurate is that?
For the Crusader point, it's not very historically accurate. They're really going with sort of like this Franken architecture where they're borrowing from various points in the medieval period, or what is stereotypically medieval, and they're creating these structures that we see in the backdrops and that you get to engage with as well. As we talked about in our last episode with Castle Domitresk, we do see a lot of Eastern European features, such as those octagonal towers, but we also see more of this sort of concentric castle where there's no easy way in. You sort of have this maze to go through in order to get to various points about it, which is which is a common design for Crusader castles. And the reason why we keep saying Crusader, there's nothing to suggest they were inspired by a particular castle. There's nothing to suggest they were inspired by a particular region or time. But as part of the game, you do get to sort of customize your character with various armor. And one of the helmets that you get to use is this sort of barboot style helmet, which is a sort of conical shape at the top. And before I continue, I am not an armor specialist in any way, shape, or form. My knowledge is very simple, but in this case, very appropriate. You get to see these crosses right in the visor, which is a huge symbol coming out of the Crusades. You see it mainly with the Templars. And everyone and their mother loves the Templars. So that's kind of why we think this is the time period in which they're trying to bring the game to in terms of the Knights story. What I'm interested, just to kind of narrate a bit more about the game, is why do we only see a castle in this sort of, not even a remote wilderness landscape? We only see it in what seems to be this light-hearted environment of like pristine mountains, wonderful colored trees. They're sort of escaped from it. Is it trying to play into that idea that this castle is separate from time itself and it's its own story?
Okay, so I think the thing to stress there is what makes this whole setting kind of absurd is that the knights, the Vikings, the samurai, they almost exist in a kind of bubble. Even though they're on the maps, you can see they're in proximity to one another. They exist in their own periods. They're self-contained in a way, which does make it sort of strange, very strange that all these cultures, all these armies could somehow coexist within miles of each other. But I think that just suits the needs of the game. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of development. Although actually, having said that, I do, because I know the director of For Honor before this was involved in a game for Nintendo Wii called Red Steel 2. So Red Steel 2 similarly dealt with a kind of syncretism of cultures. So here you've got Knights, Vikings, Samurai, right? Again, fast and loose with history, historical accuracy. Likewise, in Red Steel 2, it was set in a mix of the Wild West with Japanese elements. So you played as a gun-toting kind of samurai with a cowboy hat and a trench coat, and it was set in a kind of
It's like Shanghai Noon.
It was a first-person game, and the reason I bring it up for Honor is because it used a similar mechanic here, the shielding. So you can probably notice with the characters, they have this tripartite wheel on their backs whenever they encounter another player. And what that allows you to do is to block incoming attacks from the left, the right, or above, respectively. And I know Red Steel 2 had a similar mechanic going on where you had to kind of parry and block attacks with your katana. I think there's precedent here for a studio that sort of plays and delights in anachronism and mixing cultures and seeing what happens when you blend together these different periods. I don't know the specific genre, like a subgenre, the steampunk, for example.
Yeah.
I don't off the top of my head if there's one for that mix of samurai and cowboys. I know we're going off piece here, but that's surprisingly fruitful as a kind of motif to play with. Yeah, I think in terms of the knights existing in their own bubble, it is curious, but they're all pastiches, I'd say. The samurai land that you play through is also similarly quintessentially feudal Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Vikings, it plays into that expectation of what a Viking fortress is like, and suddenly with the Crusaders, we're playing with, well, the sort of a high vision of the Middle Ages. As to how accurate that is or what relation it bears to reality, only you can say.
And so far, none. It's just none. Well, no, I take that back. Okay, so very little would be the more appropriate one. In terms of the architecture, in terms of the castle function, they're not going to live in a castle that has ruins tumbling all around them. But we do see that in the very first one we get to with the Guardian, where it looks like it has survived several sieges over centuries of time, not back to back to back. I mean, there's vines and everything growing out of it, so it's been there a while. But in terms of castle repair, they wouldn't have left it like that because it critically weakens the place that they're trying to defend. But kind of like behind the scenes, I was telling Gavin, it's almost like they want to leave it there to show that this castle won't fall. You know, it's so strong, the people defending it are so strong and powerful that you can throw whatever you want at us, and it's not going to go anywhere. There's also this sort of medieval stereotype that we come into when we switch over to the Vikings, where we see woodland and the fortress itself is just nothing but timber. And it's almost this primitive backdrop and suggesting that the Vikings themselves and even a timber structure is just sort of inferior to the Crusaders and the Knights, which is just completely false because everything has timber in it. Everything's built with it. It's not a subpar building material in any way, shape, or form. But I do like how they kind of play into that medievalism idea. Like, we're going to keep coming back to medievalism because it's throughout pretty much every single game. So yeah, not a whole lot of historical accuracy, especially with Vikings and knights and samurais playing each other. I'm going to suggest that's not a thing.
It's almost as if what they've done is they've tried to identify these ethno-national symbols, right? So the samurai is symbolic of a particular vision of Japanese history and Japanese culture. Similarly for the Crusaders and equally for Vikings. And in dividing them up and making them all kind of be self-contained, they've given them distinctive architecture, finely different materials, but also the armour, which I know you mentioned just now. You've got the knights who are obviously ironclad, and the Vikings are quite exposed. I guess if I'm going to sum up this relationship between the Crusaders and the Vikings, anachronistic as it might be, you've got wood versus stone, and then you've got furs versus steel.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how they've done it. They've almost gone like a mind, like a mood chart, or something of a mood chart. They've kind of thought, right, well, what evokes Vikings like for popular culture? Mm-hmm. Okay, furs, bear skin, tattoos, maybe runes on stones. What evokes like the knight and the crusade as well? It's just the ironclad stone. The castles are almost purely made of stone, and then the samurai. Well, it's a mixture of kind of like reed armor and then castles like Himeji.
But an interesting thing about that and this armor, as we can see with this guy right here. He has lions sort of shielding his, like, his shoulder pads. It reminds me of Shadow of Rome, where we have gladiators coming in, and they're wearing similar armor features.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't even play into this medieval stereotype fully. They're going across time itself, which makes For Honor just like super unique in this, that not only are they existing in their own time separately, but once you engage with each other, everything about them is sort of cross-temporal.
Transhistorical.
Transhistorical. Thank you. That's the word. So yeah, like, but going back to the castle, we do see a lot of popular and common features, like some of the weapons we come across, like some of the armor, in terms of, again, I'm going to go back to when you customize the player. The visor that has all these holes in it, that's called a sugarloaf helmet, and it's about 1312 when we see it. So at least we have a like accurate time of when they're trying to play with it. And we have the ballista, which is this massive crossbow that shoots javelins at you. Obviously, that's what you need when you're sieging a castle. You have the battering ram that's literally shaped like a ram. Really not mincing any words there. All of that is absolutely 100% historical with, I guess, what they're trying to get across.
Right. Well, that's the thing is, it's very much a pick and mix approach to history here, and the game isn't making any kind of pretensions that it's historically accurate. I mean, I don't think we're holding it to that standard.
No.
But what's intriguing is to see then how these three, because initially there were three factions before they've added others, how they were distilled then into very distinctive armor sets or architectural styles. How do you communicate that? Because, funny you should mention Shadow of Rome, it's interesting that as they've gone on with this game, they've added more seasons, which means more characters, more maps, what have you. They've slowly started to blur that initial tripartite thing of Knights, Vikings, Samurai, so that you now have in the Knights faction, say, gladiators.
Okay.
You've got gladiators and gladiatorial armor. And equally for the Vikings, you now have, off the top of my head, I know at least they have a Highlander. They have a Highlander, yeah, and a kind of druidic shaman, like a kind of Boudicca character.
Okay.
And then for the I think to be fair, I think the samurai faction stays pretty kind of quote unquote pure. Like it just sticks with Japanese warriors, and then they've since added a faction based around Chinese warriors. I think that basically purloin characters from the Rants of the Three Kingdoms, which is like a whole kind of chronicle of Chinese wars in what would be the medieval era. So and there's even a pirate. There's even a pirate now, which belongs to its own unique faction. So I think they've kind of jettisoned any like historicity of this game, and that's fine. That's okay. Like I think it's just interesting then for us to comment on, well, what happens then when these boundaries are blurred? How do they maintain this distinctiveness? Particularly when they're adding these new maps. And the castles mostly are just backdrops for these different modes where you capture different points or you have to siege the castle. That's basically it. Which is why when we were trying to think about approaching this game, it was initially a kind of a struggle to think about a specific castle because, to my mind at least, there aren't any in this game. They're always just set pieces, which again isn't to detract from the game. But it's just how they're used. Unlike Resident Evil 8, where the castle was its own character, that's a bit cliche to say. Here, I wouldn't say they are, because I think to make the castle its own character in this instance would almost overshadow the heroes themselves. Really, the whole point of these castles is that they are reminiscent of real-world counterparts to evoke, say, the Crusades or Vikings or what have you, but not to cloud the priority, which are these characters, these distinct characters.
Mm-hmm. Well, much like something we're going to talk about in our next episode, where a lot of game creators and designers and even corporations borrow from other games to sort of create the worlds that we can play in for others. Ubisoft does borrow the domed architectural feature that we do see in the opening credits of For Honor. It looks almost like a citadel. Absolutely borrows that from Assassin's Creed Revelations with Hagia Sophia. And that is something that we are currently talking about in Castle Studies itself, where we have all of these words that historians from the medieval period and the early modern period are talking about in terms of, or are using to describe castles. And instead of us going through every single one to try and figure out what it means, we've just sort of figured out, well, they're mainly general, except for a couple. And there is one, there is one that sort of describes a citadel. Now, it's not this domed feature that has been penetrable with stone, because we don't actually, no one's describing it to us except as citadel, a fortress. And they are playing on that modern perception of it and taking some of the ecclesiastical structures that we do see in Assassin's Creed Revelations and others like it and saying, well, perhaps it looks similar to this. And they're creating that castle architecture around it.
Yeah, so that's interesting then, because I guess what that suggests is that, well, the castle's history or the building's history, whatever, it's divested of its original meaning. And here it becomes nothing more than set piece, like backdrop, which is fine, which is okay for a game like this. It's not pretending to do it anymore. But it is interesting to see then, talking about that pick a mix approach to history, which elements are purloined, which elements are picked, and that will depend on the game. So of course, Assassin's Creed is. What's interesting about Assassin's Creed for castles, well, aside from the assassination, a large component is the kind of parkour, the scaling element. So you have an intimate relationship with the architecture that you're climbing over. Not so much here, really. In fact, aside from climbing up ladders and going from point to capture flags or capture areas, I don't think this game is intended to instill a strong affinity or relationship with castles. They're just places to be destroyed or to be taken, and that's fine. That's okay. That suits the game in this case. And there's almost an art to that, frankly, to make a castle that isn't distracting, that doesn't detract from the core gameplay.
Well, one way that they're doing it is for this castle right here, we see it's sort of jutting into the natural features around it. It's coming out of the mountains. It's part of the mountains, so it blends into its surrounding landscape and even the landscape of the game itself. But you're right, it doesn't detract from the game if a castle isn't sort of this main level that you play. The whole purpose of this game is to attack and fight and level up in any way you can. And if part of the level is a castle, then that works for it. It's really going into the game feature itself. But I do like this term pick and mix history.
Well, it's the best I can think of.
It's actually really accurate, though.
Yeah, and I mean, I think because I don't have an insight. Actually, no, to be fair, I should have an insight into the development of this game because, and this is an earnest recommendation, this is an impromptu recommendation, on Netflix, of all places, there is actually a documentary detailing the development of For Honor with a in-depth insight into sort of like the director's vision and what happened and how it panned out in its very early stages. So I would highly recommend that. I cannot remember the name. I will put it in post. I'll put it down in the description below. But why castles are integral to this game, then, say, is because, well, aside from the duels, the one-on-one duels, the two-on-two duels, castles afford you a mixture of big open spaces to facilitate these battles, these duels, make them grand and epic, but also to funnel in swarming soldiers. Because, again, a component of this game is that, well, the heroes you choose from are these towering giants, basically. They're distinct. You're meant to see another player towering over, say, the legions of these pawns, these minions. But in a mode, for example, called Breach, I believe it's called, you capture zones not only by being there, but by helping your little minions get there as well. So you're just slashing through these crowds of people, just mowing them down. And there's certain points where they'll be funneled through drawbridges, corridors. So in terms of gameplay, then you've got this nice mix of big open spaces where you can have these one-on-one battles, big dramatic battles, and then these tighter areas where the focus is on trying to, well, depending on whether you're attacking or defending, penetrate or resist and push them back. And you have lots of these little corridors, there's also these little passageways. So, gameplay terms, castles are a nice mix of enclosures and big expansive areas. Okay, so Ali, one thing that's driving me nuts that I've seen in these maps that I didn't comprehend when I first saw it. What are those wooden boxy things on the wall?
They're just galleries.
Okay, what's a gallery?
So a gallery is wooden sort of appendage, if you will, that sticks out of the wall or the tower itself, and it just gives the person a little bit more of a vantage point to look at. So you see right here, you have those slits within it. Someone would have come in, you look, you get between each tower. It's just the sort of like patrol garrisoning factor of the castle itself. And we see them all throughout the medieval period. One that exists right now that's a really cool place to go visit is the Tower of London. So you can see not to say real life example, but you can go and experience it if you want to know a little bit more of their function.
Who would be in them though?
Just regular people not regular people garrisoning the castle. So I'm not going to say knights because that is a particular sect of elite or aristocracy or noble factions, but guards would be going and patrolling it. You can
fire arrows from them.
You can fire arrows from the slits, but the thing about them, obviously, fire beats wood. So you can just sort of dip your arrow tip right into like tar or pitch, light it on fire, down goes gallery. Very simple, but they're still effective. They're still positioned far enough away, I suppose, to give distance or to make that archer really fight for it. But you can fire arrows out of it. You can pour things out of it if you want to. So yeah, they're both aesthetic and militaristic in the same way.
Right, and on that similar point, we're looking here at the castle you go to learn the ins and outs of the game. So it's a tutorial, literally a tutorial map. There is this strange walkway platform in front of the castle doors that I found just quite peculiar. Is that based on anything in real life?
It is. So we have platforms coming out of towers usually. One good example is the medieval seal of Rochester. You see this little, I suppose, like flat platform sticking right at the top of one of the towers in that seal itself. And you'd go out and you drop things on people's head. Very simple way of just going, well, I'm gonna knock you unconscious. There you go. But as we can see from them, they're not structurally sound. Mm-hmm. They're very easily brought down. So eventually they went away, and we have what are called maculations, which is a very fancy word for basically hole in a tower.
Right.
Where you can drop things from, and you're safe from like the stones blocking you. Tattersall and Lincoln is a good example of, you want to see maculations. These fancy sort of again, appendages coming out of the tops of the towers, the tops of doors, and almost like a semicircle thing coming out to protect this platform, as it were. Mm-hmm. You hide behind the stone, drop things on people's heads. That's
what seemed most conspicuous about this kind of platform thing here. There's no shielding, there's no defense. It's like a gangway, a walkway from one bit to the other.
But that's again, to go back to that, to go back to our conversation about it doesn't need to be historically accurate. It doesn't need to be functioning in that way that some of the historical examples were. It's just a really simple way to get from point A to point B. And it fits this ruin-esque, war-torn environment that they have, where if the fight is on the other side of the gate, instead of going down, around, or even through the courtyard, go right across that platform.
Yeah, it's a good example of where they've had to compromise, I suppose, to some extent, because we're not dealing with a faithful recreation of a castle here. It's a level, really. It's a map. It's a map, just like any map in a first-person shooter or like a MOBA. The whole point is that it's meant to facilitate movement. So even if it does seem impractical as a defense, that's not really the point. Particularly when you're playing as the big hero, the big towering Goliaths that take several hits to go down. It's just interesting to see in castles where they've had to.
I doubt it's going to take several whacks to knock that thing. Look at that shoddy workmanship right there. Planks sticking up, planks crisscrossing each way.
Yeah, it's a definite contrast to the stonework, I suppose. It's to show that it's ad hoc. It's just been cobbled together. What I found really funny, and again, I don't want to seem like I'm too damning of the developers. They've been a great game. But I was looking here at this gallery, and I was trying to, because I'm a pedant basically. I was trying to see like, have they actually gone to the effort to make it so that there's a gap where someone can get in? And if you look hard enough, you can see that they've just stuck it onto the wall. So no one's getting in that. No one's getting in or out. And I really did look to see if there was some way. But that just shows how pedantic I am, how pathetic I am. But I mean, I guess more than that, it also goes to show how aesthetic these things are when it comes to like what a castle should look like, particularly a besieged castle. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, which we will return to in other episodes about other fantasy castles like this, are heraldic devices. So in this castle, see lots of lion motifs, lion heads, lion faces, and escutcheons with shields and swords, and these big, what are they? The big flags, the big tapestries hanging down from the wall.
Mm-hmm. Like the banners.
Banners, thank you. God, I can't believe I didn't think of that.
I got you.
The banners, yeah. So, what about historical precedents for that? Is that something that we would see, or is that just completely an invention of fantasy?
A bit of both. I'm going to say we don't actually see it to like this grandiose scale that we do in some of these fantastical settings that we have, but we do see them a bit more in the late medieval, which is about 1300s and up, where it's really important for you to show off your lineage. Specifically after the Black Death, we have it. After the English Civil War, we have it, where people of that sort of noble status want to show that they're important enough to have it. And since they're important enough to have it, they're going to show it off. It might be a couple coat of arms here and there, or even some banners, or even a pendant flying, but not every inch of the castle itself is going to have this sigil or anything like that. I mean, they do have some restraint compared to the game design.
I guess it's a way, though, of giving a castle an identity and a face, isn't it? Otherwise it would just be bare bricks and stone. It's probably an easy device to use. And what is interesting, doing my homework for this, just to keep up with you, keep up.
To keep up.
Again, is talking about the Black Death and talking about kind of a late medieval period for architecture and this idea of heraldic devices. They're indicative of an established nobility. Now, the funny thing with this game is that there are no kings, to my knowledge. They're just knights. They're just knights who are garrisoned in these castles, or Vikings, or what have you, but there's no crowned king. So when we're talking about these heraldic devices, I have to wonder, well, whose heraldry are they? Nobody's. They're just presumably, they're superficial. They're another example of something that's been put onto the castle to give it some kind of distinctiveness.
The artistic liberties of these designers are endless.
Yeah.
I mean, look behind you there. You have one blue banner, and you have one yellow and black banner. Mm-hmm. They're just everywhere. Mm-hmm. But they are playing into, again, this idea of medieval, this idea of besieged castles, and this idea of, okay, it has to be some elite structure, even if we don't know who it belongs to. Mm-hmm. It's still giving you the example of, I'm more powerful than you.
Mm. Do castles have much of an identity? Like you told me earlier, I know about some castles that are quite general, but there are one or two that would be standout. But looking at the ruins that you do, if that, just the remains of them, what gives a castle its distinctiveness then, or its identity?
Oh, that's a loaded question. So I won't go too heavily into it because it's a very convoluted, nebulous idea, and it's literally what I'm doing my research on, so I can't give too many spoilers. Yeah, a castle does have its identity. It not only reflects the builder or the lord's identity through it by sort of some of the styles and designs, but after they have gone and it no longer is functioning in that original intended purpose, it's still there. Whether the brick and mortar, the stone and timber, what have you, is gone and been repurposed somewhere else, the earthworks are still there. The site is still there, and it's functioning in a way that is very relatable to the community it sits in, or the landscape it sits in. It's still a focal point of power or authority. So it absolutely has this identity. But they are individualistic. So you do have to go to each one, slowly making my way through it, to figure out what that identity is and how it sort of gotten to where it is now.
So they weren't identikit castles. It wasn't like prefab castles. Someone comes along with like a distinctive,
like an IKEA built castle.
Well, yeah, I kind of wondered. Like, I'm sure there were treatises written about maybe like defenses and the ideal fortification. But in terms of the architect, whoever they were making these castles, was there like a template? Was there a standard, or was it just dependent on who? Like who was the principal actor there deciding that?
I mean, it's a bit of both.
Right.
There are some architects who have a very specific design and style, as we see with Wales. All of Edward I's castles tend to look exactly the same because it was designed by the same architect.
Okay, so who then was responsible for the design of these castles?
So for Edward I, he hired James of St. George, specifically for Carnarvon, Beaumaris, and Conway Castle. And I'm going to apologize if I mispronounced any of those, because I now realize who I'm talking to. So yeah, he has this sort of Italy-inspired castle, this Roman-inspired architecture, because obviously we want to play into that lineage of King Arthur. And we see a lot of like eagles coming out of Carnarvon. We see very like large, fanciful, double-towered gatehouses coming in. So that is iconic of this architect, and we see him putting his stamp on a king's castle itself. But then there are others who are a little more local, and we don't know in some cases who built them, but we have to imagine that that person was inspired by something the Lord told them he wanted. I want it to function this way. I want it to be X amount of meters long because, money, but also because of where his land is.
That's fascinating. So you're suggesting that even in the times of what was Edward I, then these architects or the people who commissioned them or the lords, they were leaning into this kind of ideal, this sort of, like you said, Arthurian, like a fantasy. I find that fascinating then, so that, we're talking about here these castles which are kind of, they're trading on a certain fanciful image of castles, but even the castles that they are indirectly based off of were designed with an ideal in mind, with a certain romantic vision. That's interesting. I mean, it's passed beyond the confines of this episode, but then the natural question I ask then is, well, what were the original castles? They were presumably Roman fortifications, were they? And I guess you go on and on further and further back into history.
Oh, you can keep going. So we don't know when that word castle can be truly applied to a structure because of the various cultures and societies of the time. But yeah, majority of them in the medieval period are inspired by something somewhere. And that's just the ones that are standing. I'm going to give that little caveat right there.
Right.
If we go to Wales and we look at Edward I's castles, that sort of ring of stone. I really hate that phrase, but ring of stone castles. He wants to relate his lineage, his power, his authority, and his right to rule back to the legendary King Arthur, which is rampant through Welsh folklore. And we even see it coming in with the late medieval building of Tintagel Castle in Cornwall, another place that is hugely tied to Arthurian lore.
I find that fascinating because the question that sort of hung over the end of our previous episode was, well, what is a castle? And it sort of led into this one. Now I'm left with the question of, well, where does a castle come from? Almost. Or when were the original castles? Which I don't expect an answer to, but it just...
I'm glad you don't expect one, because I don't have one.
I don't know who can answer that, but castles, they seem ever more myriad and complex as we try to kind of nail down...
Welcome to my hell.
Yeah.
Not hell. Welcome to my life.
Yeah, it sounds like...
an endless rabbit hole.
For something that I think most people take for granted, like myself, and yet there's more nuance to be extracted from them. Hopefully we can get onto that at some point. Which
I think in our next episode we can unpick that sort of folkloric, heritage-esque pop culture idea of a castle.
Yeah, but before then, as always, Ali, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And anybody listening, or everybody listening, let's not be pessimistic. Everybody listening, thank you for listening. And if you want to keep up with us, I'll put our social media details in the description. and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, take care. Bye, everyone. Bye.